All right, so we should be live now. I'm Nick Redding. I'm the president and CEO of Preservation Maryland, and excited to be with everyone here tonight as we talk with some friends who have come together around a really cool project in historic Hagerstown, Maryland. But take a step back first. Preservation Maryland, we'll talk about who's here. I'll talk about Preservation Maryland for a second, and then we'll do some introductions so that we know everyone who's with us tonight. We have on this call with us tonight, obviously myself with Preservation Maryland. Reggie, do you want to introduce yourself there quickly?
Sure. My name is Reggie Turner. I am the chairman of the Western Maryland CDC, and I am also a Maryland Commissioner of African American History and Culture.
And then Aaron?
I'm Aaron Leventhal. I'm an archaeologist with the Maryland Department of Transportation State Highway Administration, and I worked on the 417 Jonathan Street Archaeology Project.
Cool. And then we've got Amy.
Hey, I'm Amy Oden. I'm a producer with Maryland Public Television. Mostly do work for digital at the station, and came over to Hagerstown to do some filming.
Cool. So as you can see, we have an interesting quartet of different people who have come together around this issue and everything that's going on here. So Preservation Maryland is the statewide historic preservation organization. We're 90 years old here in 2021. So we're founded back in 1931, and we've done a lot of different things during that period of time. And historic property redevelopment is one of them that we've done that has been something we've done early on in our period, and then we took a long time off. And so it's been almost 45 years since we actually purchased a building for rehabilitation. And we got involved in this project in historic Hagerstown, largely because of Reggie and his community partner, Terrence Moore, who have both been strong advocates for the community. And 417 North Jonathan really jumped out as a property that needed to be saved. It was something that was going to be lost otherwise. And so we'll get the chance to talk a little bit about the cabin itself and how there's archaeology in this documentary that's done. But I wondered if maybe, since Reggie knows the community best of everybody on this call, if Reggie, you want to give the short history of Jonathan Street, why it matters, what it is, where it's located, why people should know about this place, and then that kind of gives us an opportunity to center the history of the cabin.
Sure. I wrote a few notes so that there's so much to say about this community that we're learning. I had to narrow it down because you gave me only 2 minutes. So.
Well, you can take a little bit more time. I want to leave time for questions, but yeah, you can take your time. I think it's a fascinating story, and unfortunately, it's something a lot of people don't know about. It's a critical piece, not only of Maryland history, but really American history.
Yeah. Well, the Jonathan Street community is situated in the city of Hagerstown, Maryland, here in Western Maryland. The African American community here really started to take shape around 1818 when Asbury Methodist Church opened up as a missionary church for African Americans. Subsequently, after that church, Bethel AME Church was incorporated in 1820. And one of the most prominent members of the community during that period was Reverend Thomas Henry, who became the pastor of Bethel AME in the 1830s. Also kind of working our way through during that time frame, we had the formation of the Moxley Band in the 1850s. And the Moxley Band was a Civil War era band made up of 3 brothers and 9 other members originally. And many of them gained their freedom when they joined the US Colored Troops. That band performed here in Maryland, in Virginia, as far south as Brownsville, Texas, and then after the war, they returned to Hagerstown. One of the unique things in regards to the community is that Bethel AME Church and the Moxley Band were really the only two kind of institutions that survived kind of pre-war and post-war to be talked about. Also, another prominent member of the community was Jacob Wheaton. Jacob Wheaton was a Civil War nurse that was a member of Bethel AME. He also treated folks in the church, which became a makeshift hospital during the war. And then after the war, in 1868, he became the first Black man in the state of Maryland to vote. The link between Reverend Thomas Henry, the Moxley Band, and Jacob Wheaton is they all attended Bethel AME Church, which was hugely influential in the community in regards to it as a society as a whole, and also politically as well. As we transitioned out of Reconstruction through Lynn Bowman's book that she wrote on Jonathan Street, which I have a copy of here, 10 Weeks on Jonathan Street, she estimates that the community was its most vibrant in the early 1900s. At that time, there were 5 barbershops, there was a candy store, 3 restaurants, 2 saloons, the Harmon Hotel, owned by the wealthiest Black man in the community, Walter Harmon, a laundromat, and 2 grocery stores. In the Jonathan Street community, 2 properties were in the Green Book. That was the Harmon Hotel, which was in the 200 block, and then Ship's Tea Room, that was in the 300 block. The Jonathan Street community was the main thoroughfare through town that led you to All Points Northeast, and was converted to Route 11 at some point. And then Route 11 was moved from that community in the 80s. And one important point to talk about in regards to the Jonathan Street community, as we moved towards the 1900s, African Americans were funneled into that community, and it became a red line community through the passing of the Civil Rights Act. But it was still a robust business community, entrepreneurial community, through the 60s and even longer. But that started to change over time. All the historic structures, the original structures that I am speaking of, have been lost for the most part. The community has been rezoned to be residential. There are 4 historic districts in the city of Hagerstown, and the Jonathan Street community was excluded from that. And really the municipal government, over time killed the entrepreneurial spirit of this community. And that's where we have stepped in. This relationship with Preservation Maryland started when I was advocating for 335 North Jonathan Street, which was the home of the Moxley Band and also the band room in regards to where they practiced. I reached out to Elizabeth Chateau because I was desperate for help when we were trying to save that structure. She put me in contact with Nick, and I sent him an email, and I guess from there we will say the rest is history.
Yeah, and that brings us up to the present. That's a good connection there. And I remember, I think people watching this, and whether they're watching it live or they watch it the recorded version, and this will be made available in a recorded version, but whether you're working in Hagerstown or you're working in Baltimore or you're working across the country, I think you can take heart from the fact that this is not a story of we found a threatened building and we saved it and it was just this great, wonderful all coming together. Unfortunately, the story starts with that Moxley Band being demolished. And I remember sort of sharing with Reggie, like, well, this may be the one that gets everyone's attention, and now we may have an opportunity to do something. And it was only within probably the next few weeks that we were looking at this little, what we had heard was a cabin, was going to be demolished. It had been hit by a police cruiser in 2018. And the older gentleman, Mr. Davis, who was living there, Richard Davis, was moving out because it needed a lot to be fixed. And we were going to lose this building. And so we had just launched at Preservation Maryland a property redevelopment program. And so the idea was, okay, well, let's buy this thing and then let's do something good with it for the community. We looked at a lot of different uses. A lot of people have asked, and I wouldn't be surprised if people, on this Facebook are curious about what it's going to be eventually, because it's still sort of a story being written right now, because it is being rehabbed as we speak. But what actually is going to happen, the end result is that we have a partnership with Habitat for Humanity of Washington County. And the plan is to rehabilitate it and then sell it for owner-occupied affordable housing. Try and build, Reggie and Terrence speak eloquently about building Black wealth and Black equity in the community. And we felt like this is a way we can do that without, changing really in one way what this building has always been, which is a home. And I think that that's important. We looked at, could it be a museum? Could it be a community center? Could it be office space? All those things just as part of our due diligence. And what we also learned is in order to do that, we would have to destroy the thing about it that's so unique, which is that it's small and that, it has narrow passageways and all those sorts of things. We'd have to open up doorways, and we just didn't want to sacrifice all of that. So the building is being preserved. It's taking a heck of a lot of work. Sometimes people say, you're like, oh, this home, they look at a home and they say, this has good bones. I mean, there are some good ribs here and there on this one. I'm not sure all of it is good bones. We've had to lift the structure, rebuild the foundation underneath of it. So we lifted it about 12 inches or so. And as Aaron will tell you, he crawled underneath the thing before it was stabilized. So he was he was willing to get underneath of there before it was completely secure. But we are now in the process of taking off. It has several old roofs on it. We're taking those off. We're going to be putting a standing seam metal roof on it. We're going to be recovering it in siding. It is a log structure. And I'm going to kick it over here to Aaron a little bit to talk about the history that they uncovered as a part of the historical archaeology work and then the actual excavation that was done. But the phase of rehabilitation for those who live in the community or watching from Hagerstown or whomever is interested in this is that it should be done by late May, early June in terms of rehab. And then we're going to hold on to it through the summer, hopefully settling someone in it in the fall, but giving us the opportunity to do some open houses, particularly as the pandemic lifts its nasty grip and we can kind of reconvene in safe ways to allow community members, both from the Jonathan Street community and outside of Jonathan Street, to come in and see the structure, see what's been done, and see the potential that history holds for the community. And the potential for history for this community, and I think most, is not just telling a story about what happened there. That story is incredibly important. And as Reggie mentioned, I mean, it goes back to 1818, making this one of the oldest free Black communities, not only in the state, but in the nation. But it also holds a tremendous potential for that story of building Black equity and Black wealth, for lifting up a community, for revitalizing a community and using the best attributes of its history to sort of launch it into its next chapter, in a story that is to be written. So it is also, as people have probably seen in the local press, it has attracted a tremendous amount of attention. Never hurts when you get the rock star archaeologists out there. Everybody wants to know what they find in the ground. And then MPT, of course, our partners here who are also going to talk tonight, which have done this fantastic job in partnership with the State Highway Administration, the Maryland Department of Transportation, to chronicle this work, so to bring this story forward. And so as a result of Reggie's work and the archaeology side and the documentary side, we've attracted the attention of some other funders, as well as the state of Maryland. And, as was reported in the local press, there's significant infusion of capital coming to tackle more projects on Jonathan Street and take what we had hoped sort of this little cabin that could, this catalyst, and pour sort of, fuel in the fire of revitalization and spread that out to the broader community so that everyone can feel that, from the community center to more historic home rehabs and beyond. So we're thrilled to be a part of that and to try and help start something that is even more sustainable. And we're just pleased that the board was crazy enough to allow me to go out and buy this thing. So that being the story of kind of what's happening right now, and I should say the firms working on it, because most of them have provided a lot of pro bono support, deserve to be mentioned, which is Worcester Eisenbrandt out of Baltimore City, a large scale construction rehab firm, is our general contractor and managing the whole project from that end, and self-performing most of the log preservation work. Ziegler Sneed Architects is our architecture firm, which is a preservation architecture firm. I saw that they were the architect of record on Lawyers Mall in Annapolis, which they just cut the ribbon on today. And we also are working with SGH Engineering, and they were the ones who climbed in the building when it didn't look so great and the logs were all moved around from being hit by a police cruiser, and said, yeah, it can be saved, and gave us all sort of the hope that that was possible. So that's the team that's come together to work on this project. But obviously, we wouldn't know nearly as much as we know, particularly due to dendrochronology and the historical research, and then the excavation in the backyard, if it weren't for our partners at the State Highway Administration. So I might go over to Aaron, and I think we probably have to edit the post here. The billing, we had top billing for Dr. Julie Schablitsky, and Aaron is Julie's fill-in tonight. But we're in able hands. Julie's a little under the weather, and Aaron was there getting his hands dirty on this dig. So he has Jonathan Street under his fingernails. He knows this story pretty well, and can talk to us a little bit about what happened there and what you guys found.
Cool. Okay, so I've got some notes because we found out a lot of information, and I'm going to go through these, and there's probably going to be questions about artifacts and the process. So anyway, again, I'm Aaron Leventhal. I work for the MDOT SHA, and I'm an archaeologist. I worked on the project. And so how we conducted our survey was such, like, first we went out to the site and completed a site visit, because we needed to see what we were dealing with and what site conditions were like. You know, we heard that a police cruiser ran into the building, so we really didn't know what to expect. But we were looking for surface features, namely, things like old wells or old outhouse holes, etc. And after our initial visit, we undertook a little bit of historic research of our own. So we investigated the title chain, got into the historic censuses, and did a little bit of genealogical research ourselves. And we did that in order to get an idea of whose past we were dealing with out there. And because of our research, we're able to glean information about the ethnicities, occupations, household economies, and numbers of people in households, and a few other interesting facts about the people that lived at the house site at 417. After that, we compiled and researched historic maps to try and figure out how the property and the surroundings evolved over time. Like when the area transitioned from undeveloped land to farmland to urban land, how and when the block and neighborhood filled out, if there were additions or subtractions from the house or from the property itself, and the ages and the types of surrounding properties around the house. Then we dipped a little bit into what's known about the natural environment, primarily because we needed to know what types of soils we could anticipate and whether or not there were natural soils at all on the lot, or if we were going to deal with property that had been cut and filled. Then we had a dendrochronology study completed. Wood samples were taken from the original building members, and then they were analyzed in the hopes of finding out the dates of when the trees were felled and the time after felling when the house was then constructed. After the dendrochronology study was complete, we got the report, we hit the dirt, and we completed what's known as a shovel test pit survey. So what we did was I went out there and divided the property into a 10-foot grid and we dug 30 shovel-sized holes at every grid intersection across the entire parcel. We also dug a few holes around the foundation and in a few of the depressions we saw in the yard. Each hole was about 1.5 feet deep, and that's to the depth of culturally sterile subsoil. So, you know, the time pre-humans in North America. After we dug the shovel test pits, we excavated a few test units, and those are the square test unit, square excavations you see on the Discovery Channel, History Channel, whatever. So we dug 4 square 5x5 units and 1 2.5 by 5 foot rectangular test unit. And we dug those in locations of interesting artifact recoveries, and also one against the house foundation in order to investigate house construction dates, get information on building techniques and building sequences. And then a couple of months ago, like Nick said, we investigated inside of the crawl space. So we waited until the colder months so the creepy crawlies could be frozen to death, and most were, but not all. And we got in there in order to look for intentionally placed artifacts inside the foundation and things that would have been lost when they fell through the floorboards. Sometimes that's where you find the really cool stuff. So what did we find? We found a lot. I think we found nearly 3,000 historic artifacts during the investigation and around 300 faunal remains. Artifacts were mostly kitchen and domestic artifacts. So you can think of ceramic food serving, cooking, and storage vessel fragments. We also found a lot of architectural debris, so 19th and 20th century nails, spikes, bolts, bricks, and building stone, various types of mortar. Like I said, 300 faunal remains, so you can think of that as food waste animal bone. We also found furniture parts, so that's broken fragments of furniture lost during discard or recycling. So what I personally think was pretty cool is that in the crawl space, we found the pre-1897 and probably original fireplace location. The foundation was still there. So what did we learn after digging all this dirt? We learned a whole lot, and it's real tough to kind of summarize all this in a few minutes. But the house was built with recycled wood building materials. So exactly dating construction was pretty much impossible. But the trees we know were felled as early as 1739, which is super early for this part of the state. So there was a building somewhere probably close to this built before the first half of the 18th century passed. But our historic research suggests that a guy named Philip Fisher built the house from those salvaged materials between 1837 and 1840. And we found that there are 3 intact archaeological layers in the backyard. So basically, as you dig deeper, you're taking a time capsule back in time. So the shallowest deposit, the deposit that's closest to the surface, is early 20th century to the present day. The middle deposit is late 19th to early 20th century, and the deepest deposit dates from the mid to late 19th century. And like I said, each deposit is discrete, and each deposit contains a ton of artifacts, and artifacts equal information in this case. So the original fireplace that I mentioned, it was located inside the north wall, and our map research suggests that it was removed by 1897. The stairs to the loft and a closet were located to the right of the fireplace, and there may have been a fire in the house, and that could have possibly started in the chimney. The fire may be the reason why the room that's in the north ceased being a kitchen and an addition to the west was built, and that shows up on all of our historic maps from 1897 on. So in 1891, there was a guy named Frederick J. Hahn, and he purchased the property. He sold it to the National Realty and Improvement Company of Washington County a bit later in 1910. So it may have been Mr. Hahn or his tenants who were the last individuals to use the old fireplace. And it may have been Hahn who dealt with the house fire, dismantled the fireplace, and added the addition prior to 1897. So circa 1897, the house was heated with a stove against the south wall and possibly by a cooking fireplace or stove addition or stove in the addition. So prior to the late 19th century addition, the house's room layout resembled a traditional old world German house, German house plan that was brought to the New World by early German immigrants. And during the 18th and early 19th centuries, that house type that you see at 417 Jonathan was commonly found on the Maryland and Pennsylvania frontier. Philip Fisher, the guy who built the house, and the earliest occupants were probably of German heritage. And the earliest artifacts from the deepest buried surface that we recorded is associated with these people. So some of the artifacts that we recovered from the steep level include fragments of ceramic tablewares. So we had things like white salt glazed stoneware that's datable to 1690 to 1785, blue-printed Chinese motif pearlware, which is datable to 1784 to 1830, and blue transfer printed floral pearlware that's datable from 1818 to 1830. So this is kind of interesting, but while dating earlier than the cabin construction, these dishes could have been brought to the cabin by the first site occupants, who, like I said, may have been German immigrants. So the question was raised in the field, how can we tell a cultural difference between the European descended early residents and the historically documented later African-American residents through the archaeology and through the recovered artifacts? Well, we found out that we totally could, and it was through the analysis of the faunal artifacts that we recovered. So it seems that the earlier white occupants ate more medium and low quality cuts of meat. And that suggests some level of poverty and a reliance on dishes like stews, roasts, and hams. While the later African-American occupants in the late 19th and early 20th centuries appear to have eaten kind of high on the hog, they ate more high and medium quality cuts during the early 20th century and ensuing years. So Reggie, I think this kind of jives with what you were saying about how the community was really, kind of going off during the early 20th century. Additionally, so there was no evidence of raising or butchering livestock on the property. So all people who lived here had access to butchers and markets in town in Hagerstown. One of the artifacts that we recovered that probably has strong connections to late 19th and early 20th century African-American culture is a Hoyt's cologne bottle that we recovered from the backyard excavations. And Hoyt's cologne was a late 19th and early 20th century fragrance. And it was made in Philadelphia, and the stuff had, if you're superstitious, had some powers. It was thought to bring the wearer good luck. Other possible folk magic related artifacts that we recovered, and these aren't necessarily related to African-American culture, European American cultures practice folk magic, and some of the artifacts that I'm going to talk about next, they kind of are cross-cultural. So we found a charm that was in the form of a pierced metal disc that's probably a dime. And so it was pierced because it was worn around the neck or around the wrist, and it's a good luck charm. And then this one is really pretty neat. So we found a cat heel bone, and there's use wear on the cat heel bone, like it had been carried around and rubbed a lot. And so we did a little bit of research on folk magic, and there's stuff out there on the web about witch bones and cat bones. Basically, that artifact would have functioned similar to how a rabbit's foot would function today. Good luck charm. So that kind of wraps it up. And, I'd like to say, this was a great project to do in Hagerstown, because archaeologically, this part of the state doesn't get a lot of attention. And Hagerstown, and this neighborhood specifically, it's got a ton of American history in it. And it was great to do it. I had a great time. I hope everybody, that visited the site had a great time too. And I hope it was rewarding for everybody else as much as it was for me and our crew. I mean, we loved it. So
Yeah, absolutely, and hopefully we can have you back out. It's always good to end on a high note, and so I like that you went out on the cat's heel. I mean, what else do you? That's pretty much the best thing. So Amy, so we're kind of building to this crescendo here of our MPT and the partnership with MPT, and thrilled to be kind of co-hosting this live event tonight to talk about how you guys have worked in partnership, not only here in Jonathan Street, but elsewhere. So I think people might be interested to know how the partnership kind of came about and what you guys are covering and where people can watch it and all that kind of stuff. And we'll post a link to the MPT video of Jonathan Street so people can, in the comments here, so people can pick that up. And we'll talk a little bit about it. And then I'd love to know about how you do your work and how much time goes into it and all the magic behind video production.
Oh, sure. It's funny that you say it's a crescendo. I feel like the cat heel was like the pinnacle of
It's gonna be hard. I hope you have your own cat heel.
Well, I mean, I'm the guy that comes in at not at the end necessarily, but sort of like in the middle of the process that I have the least amount of exciting things to reveal. So, don't get too excited. But so I've been working with the folks at SHA for a couple years now. This specific project has been going for about a year. But prior to that, I got acquainted with Aaron and Julie through a project that they were working on that Julie had kind of pitched to folks at MPT saying like, oh, this is a really remarkable find. There was a cemetery excavation in Prince George's County. And I don't want to divulge too much about it because the segments that I produced are on MPT's website, but there was some really unusual remains that were unearthed during that process. And so the story wound up getting put in my lap as somebody who does a lot of short form for digital at MPT. So that was how I got acquainted with everyone. And then after that, Julie said that she had sort of been interested in doing more digital segments, and sort of it was a way to, get awareness about the work that they were doing. And so then we entered into kind of a longer term, more formal partnership to do the series that I've been producing that the Jonathan Street segment was a part of. So that's titled Maryland Underground, and there are going to be 6 segments total in the series, but 4 of them are finished. And I can talk a little bit about the others, I suppose. But basically the process is that, Julie and I sit down and say, okay, well, what are the bigger projects that you guys are working on in the coming year? And we kind of kick things back and forth and say, well, is there enough here to film, or like, are there community members that would be interested in being interviewed, right? Because that's always part of the process, is like, I can't just have the voices of the archaeologists. I think it's important to talk to folks who like live in the places where these things are happening, and kind of find out what the ramifications for local folks are. But so, right. So taking all that into consideration, we sort of like charted out a spreadsheet that we kind of track and modify and say, oh, well, this thing's happening in the spring. And, I feel like they're very busy in the spring and the fall. And so that's perfect for me as somebody who also has to be outside when I'm working. So I try to come down to the site wherever they are. I try to come down. Usually I'll do 2 days. And I try to get there when they've found some things, but when the digging is sort of still active. So I do tend to try to film some actual things being unearthed, but it's nice once I get to a site for them to say, oh, we already have this box of artifacts for you to kind of look at. So yeah, the Jonathan Street piece is the second in the series. And I guess I can back up and mention the others. I did one prior to that on a cabin, the Bailey cabin in Cambridge, that there was sort of a lot of colloquial knowledge, a lot of like community knowledge that there was what was rumored to be a slave cabin on this private property. And so they set out to figure out if that was true. Then there was the Jonathan Street segment, and then a segment that I did in Newtown Neck, which is in St. Mary's County, where there's some debate actively about where the residences of enslaved people would have been on a plantation that was owned by the Jesuits. And then there's some more work going on in Cambridge to try and see if it's feasible to locate the home of Harriet Tubman's father, Ben Ross. So those are the 4 segments that have already finished and just went back to Cambridge to shoot more on the hunt for Ben Ross's cabin recently. So that will be another sort of a part 2 segment. And then there's the last segment that I think we're probably going to work on, pending kind of solidification of plans, right, is like potentially some work around a church in Montgomery County, but that's sort of to be determined. So we plan a couple months out, and I try to spend a day or 2 at the site in each location. But
And so how much footage are you shooting, and how much editing time does it take to do them? Because they're pretty tight little pieces. Are they, maybe give people a sense for that, particularly if they're listening in and curious how this kind of gets made, and or if they're thinking about doing something for a site of their own?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So for each of these, I tend to shoot 2 interviews a piece. And they're usually pretty quick interviews, you know, definitely less than half an hour, probably more like 15 minutes. And then I like to do the interviews first because I like to sort of get an idea of the sound bites that I might use later, and sort of like what I think is interesting that I could translate into a visual idea that somebody said. So I like to try to get those not out of the way first, but I like to try to get them in the can, as they say, first. And then I just sort of stick around and I'm a fly on the wall, and shoot whatever I can to illustrate the things that have been told to me. And then editing is, yeah, usually a week or 2. I feel like it's kind of hard to put a firm number on it because I'm always like spinning a bunch of different plates. But yeah, once I actually sort of sit down and glue myself to it, it's at least 5 days.
Cool. Well, I think that, you know, obviously the video, you know, it brings a lot of attention to this project and kind of brings it to life. And I feel like in a sense, it's like the perfect marriage of archaeology and outreach, because the archaeology really brings to life people who otherwise would sort of be lost to history, right? I think that that's one of the beautiful things about archaeology. I think a lot of times people kind of like struggle with, well, why does it matter to dig up, you know, pottery sherds from the 1780s? Like, what does that tell us? But obviously, or a bone for that matter. But obviously, as Aaron was saying, I mean, this tells us what they ate, and that, you know, that there was poverty at one point, and then things got better for a different group of people who were there. And why is that? And that they had superstitions and worries and anxieties just like we did, in living through outbreaks of disease and pandemics just like we do. And it's so much harder to disassociate yourself from the past, or say, well, that's old stuff and it doesn't impact my life today, to see those connections. And I feel like the archaeology brings that to life, and the video puts it in front of everyone in a medium that, you know, they're familiar with. So it's incredibly important work, and so good to see the State Highway Administration's like amazing research program, which I think a lot of people who don't live and breathe preservation, you know, when we said like, well, we're working with State Highway Administration, Maryland Department of Transportation, they're like, are they building a road there? You know, and so we have to explain that they have one of the most robust, if not the most robust, research programs for archaeology in the state, and are just doing tremendous work. Aaron, I'm curious, you mentioned, and please, if people are watching and have any questions, we'd be happy to answer them. We have a little bit of time here. And I'm going to talk about sort of the next steps for the project and how people can get involved. But Aaron, you said that there wasn't as much archaeology getting done in places like Hagerstown, western part of the state. What drives that? What do you think is a part of that? Is it just a matter of you guys can't be everywhere at all times? Is it regulatory driven? And I suppose, you know, it'd be good to have you back, but what accounts for that? Do you know?
Well, it's a combination of things. So the archaeology that gets done out there that's state highway administration related is regulatory driven. But, you know, a lot of the time, our surveys are linear along existing roads. You know, occasionally we build a new road and then we will do a lot of archaeology. But really, some of the counties in Maryland, they just don't have the strongest preservation ordinances. So archaeology isn't required before a building is torn down or a potential site is destroyed. I mean, it's kind of simple as that. There just aren't the regulations out there that would require this type of research that would, you know, dig up and provide information to the public that's interesting, you know, informative, links today to the past, teaches lessons, you know, enhances quality of life in general.
Yeah, it makes sense. And, you know, obviously, can't speak to Washington County's archaeological ordinance, but I know here in Frederick County where I live, we don't have one, and they're working on one. I know County Executive Gardner has been a champion of preservation here and expanding that. And I know certain counties have really robust archaeological programs like Anne Arundel County, and Prince George's and Montgomery, and then it, you know, it waxes and wanes. And obviously, I think sometimes it is difficult to make that compelling argument for it because, again, people just kind of get back to like, well, it's just stuff from the ground. But it really does tell a story. You know, Reggie, I'm curious the kind of I think it's interesting, all well and good to talk about the project, but any sense for feedback from the community? What are people saying about this kind of project? How has archaeology changed their opinion on what's going on? Has it opened people's eyes to this? I think it's important for people to think about that when they're tackling a project in their community. If there's an opportunity for archaeology and things like that, is it changing perceptions?
It is truly changing perceptions in our community. You know, as the Johnson Street community deteriorated, there has been a negative connotation in the broader community about it, that it wasn't of worth value. And unfortunately, if you read our local newspaper, the Herald Mail, you'll still see a lot of that sentiment in those that don't understand and don't care. But this is no longer just the Johnson Street community. It is the historic Johnson Street community, which is hugely important. And to truly bring this story, you know, to bring this community back, we have to continue to dig and reckon with the past and how did it get to the point of where it is, you know. And as a financial advisor, you know, I understand that the economics are important as well, right? Because you can't throw a lot of money at projects and without a return on investment and think that you're still going to be able to get funds. You know, and what I look at through the lens of a financial advisor is, and I tell this story many times, is that the average white family has a net worth of $171,000. The average Black family has a net worth of $17,000. And by 2053, it is estimated that African Americans will have a negative net worth. The quickest way that we can stabilize just this community itself, which is a microcosm of communities all over the country, is home ownership, stabilizing home ownership. This went from the early 1900s to an African American owned community, entrepreneurial community. Now it's mainly renters. So obviously that plays into where the community is today. And I believe putting our marker down at this little cabin that you would miss if there wasn't so much activity going on out in front of it is important work, but it's also hugely symbolic of of the revival that we would like to see happen throughout the entire community. And it's really exciting to see, you know, Secretary Holt and others recognize that vision, looking at the historic ties and the structures that are left and the value that is there to the community.
Yeah, it's an exciting place, and it's the building is interesting. And I know like Worcester Eisenbrandt has told us, our contractors out there that are overseeing the rehab, that they have never been stopped as much as they have been by people walking by who either want to tell them something about what they knew about the cabin or that they were always interested in it, or they just want to know what's going on with it. You know, I think every time I'm out there, somebody stops and is taking a picture. It's, you know, something positive is happening. And I think that that's an important piece that people can't overlook about the value of preservation. You know, saving something also suggests in a very physical way that that specific place matters, and that that community that surrounds it by extension also matters. And I think, you know, I've shared this with Reggie, that it's critically important that there's representation of all things, so that, you know, I was just thinking about this recently. My daughter was looking at something and she was looking at astronauts and she was like, why are there no girls? You know, she's 4 years old and she's like, I want to be an astronaut. And it was sort of like a heartbreaking moment where you're like, well, you can be, don't worry. Like, this is the past. You know, but the same thing is there for other communities that have been overlooked, and to suggest that, well, that history obviously doesn't matter because they're not saving buildings in my neighborhood. And now we are. And that history has always mattered. But hopefully this is a very physical way of telling everyone. So yeah, it's this little cabin. It holds so much in there. I don't know if I'm going to jump over here and see, there is a question. Well, that's fantastic. What needs to happen to make this into part of Washington County school curriculum? My first and lasting impression of Black history in school was slavery, not entrepreneurship and home ownership. And that comes from Tyree Sterling. So, you know, Reggie, I guess you're at the local level. Do you have any thoughts on engagement with school curriculum?
We're working on it. That's the best that I can say at this point. We're still in the point of building relationships. You know, we've been building relationships with the public school. We've been building relationships with Hagerstown Community College. And again, I will plug Lynn Bowman's book, 10 Weeks on Jonathan Street. This book is a beautiful resource guide, and it only scratches the surface. This book is meant for young children and adults to pick the story up and carve out other interesting stories and families that really have not been expounded upon. You know, in the early 1900s, Madam C.J. Walker came to Hagerstown to visit Jacob Wheaton. Frederick Douglass in the 1870s came to Hagerstown to raise money for Bethel AME. You know, this community is so closely tied to many of our national stories. It's just an exciting time and an opportunity to rebirth with the community, and giving our young people an opportunity to understand that they've come from a very, very rich history. And many of their exploits are a roadmap to how we be successful in the future.
Yeah, it's a great answer. It's a fantastic question too. You know, Black history is much broader than just slavery. That is one critical aspect to it. But obviously, as you can see from Jonathan Street, it starts before it, it goes after it. There's a continuum of it, and I think getting it into the classroom would be great. I know we're also talking about partnering with our colleagues in the arts community. I know the Museum of Fine Arts in Hagerstown has been really a champion of trying to get more engaged. And so we're hoping to be announcing some joint programming with them about sketching Jonathan Street and getting out there and sort of seeing the history and taking some time to really look at it, because there's really some quite beautiful buildings there. I mean, I'm a sucker for the log building, so I'm cool with 417, but there's a bunch of really beautiful buildings up and down that street. That, you know, if you just drive past, you're going to overlook. So it's an opportunity to slow down and sort of be present with the history in the community. And our colleagues there have been great, as have the Heart of the Civil War Heritage Area. And I know we're approaching them for funding, and we're approaching a lot of different people in partnership with the Western Maryland CDC, on which Reggie and Terrence and others are there. And we're hoping that can be sort of a catalytic group that kind of carries on some of this work. As a statewide group, you know, we're looking for projects all across the state that we're engaging in. We have another property redevelopment project on City Dock in Annapolis, very different place than Jonathan Street, right at the water's edge, where we're going to be lifting the last standing waterman's cottage, the Burtis House, to elevate it outside of what's expected to be the sea level rise down there at City Dock. So from community revitalization to climate change adaptation, we're tackling and trying to put preservation in the middle of interesting and relevant conversations. And we also have a workforce development program, which we're hoping to bring to these projects, that's in partnership with the National Park Service. We're actually training young adults and recent veterans in partnership with our colleagues at the Park Service and supporting their work to get more people involved in historic trades work. So preservation really sits at the juncture of a lot of important conversations, which is why we're so happy to be able to bring this one to everyone tonight. In terms of next steps for Jonathan Street, the links are below in this video where you can learn more about what's happening there. Some update videos that we did a couple weeks ago. We're gonna have some more coming about sort of where we're at currently on the project. There's always an opportunity to give. And the cool thing about giving to a project like this is it goes into our revolving fund. So when the money is deployed to Jonathan Street, eventually it will be sold because it's a habitat home. It'll be sold at a very affordable price, but anything that comes back to us goes into the revolving fund so we can revolve it again. So in a sense, you're making a gift in perpetuity when you support that fund, which is fantastic stuff. So I guess seeing if there's any other questions out here, a few more comments. Well, there's a question about metal detecting, and you know, we're gonna have a conversation forthcoming about how the metal detecting community and archaeologists can work together a little bit better. I don't know, Aaron, if you want to preempt that conversation or talk about that at all. And then also, I know that's a tough one to dive into, but I'm also curious just where you're digging currently. Are you out in the field putting shovels in the ground right now?
We just got back. I just got back yesterday, so hence the early season tan. So we were working on the Eastern Shore in Blackwater, and so we made some pretty cool discoveries that I think are going to hit the news in a couple of weeks. So I can't spoil that. But yeah, metal detecting. We work with metal detectors ourselves. I have a metal detector, and we work with avocational metal detectorists occasionally. You know, some of these guys that do this stuff on the weekends, they have the best information because they do this stuff every weekend as a hobby. So in the past, there's been a lot of kind of a prickly relationship between some archaeologists and avocational metal detectorists. But I think, you know, as the years pass, that's kind of, that relationship is starting to warm. And I think that's a good thing.
Yeah. And we have a whole conversation coming up that we're doing with the Maryland Historical Trust about sort of the partnership between the two that people can tune into, which is a very different topic. Amy, are you working on any cool documentary projects beyond the archaeology side that people should keep an eye out for?
Oh, sure. We're always doing a bunch of different stuff at MPT. So right now, things have been a little bit shorter form than usual, just due to the pandemic, most of it. But there's some ongoing series work there. We launched a campaign this summer called the Be Inspired campaign. That's just sort of like highlighting lots of local folks that are finding ways to sort of change the way they do things during the pandemic to be of service to their communities. So I've been working with a bunch of different local regional organizations to accomplish that. Production's kind of different right now, you know, so it can be a little bit tricky, but starting to get back out there more and more with the camera, so that's good. I also just recently pitched a snowball story to do over this coming summer, so that'll hopefully be something that's like, you know, a little lighter than all of the coronavirus related things.
Yeah, I'm into it. If you need a ride along for your snowball story, let me know.
Yeah.
So before we depart, there were a couple just last minute questions here. One was about what happened after the police cruiser hit it. That's always an interesting part of the story. Mr. Davis needed to leave it, and I believe Reggie, you might know exactly what happened, but I know it's part of his personal story. But I know he had to leave the home.
Mr. Davis left the home. I went before City Hall roughly 2 years ago, advocating for that in 335 with the city and the then mayor. That conversation really didn't go anywhere. And then when we conceded on 335, Mr. Davis and his caregivers reached out to give us the opportunity to save the home. And that's when we started working on that project. But at this point, the city and the county really haven't jumped on board the work in the Johnson Street community. We hope that they will become partners in this work, because this work we've embarked upon is improving the entire city. Because if the Johnson Street community wins, everybody wins. And for far too long, it's been left behind. And I am prayerful that there will be a turn where they'll become more participatory in the future.
Yeah, I think we have a great opportunity for that. And I know that the state and the Hogan administration has been incredibly supportive, and other entities at that level. And I know we're having conversations with members of city council, and I think we remain really optimistic too, and have had good conversations with the mayor, and hope that we can take what's being done at this cabin and kind of move that to the next step with some of those new funds that are available. And so I think that that'll be a story we can bring everybody. There's another question just rolled in before we're gonna adjourn promptly at 8. Is how long was the house vacant before we were able to purchase it? I think it probably sat vacant for about 2 years. We bought it in June of 2020. I remember it was at a point where closings were still kind of scary because of COVID, and the closing agent sat in another room and watched me sign. It was a very surreal process. And I sat there alone with a mask on and signed, and then they had me put hand sanitizer on after I was done. But so we bought it in 2020, in June of 2020, and I think it was hit in the summer of 18.
I believe it was October of 18 when he was displaced from it. It's crazy to think that this has moved this far and that much time has lapsed. But yeah, I believe it was the fall of 2018.
Right. And then the reason it took us a little bit of time from June to, we actually broke ground on construction in about probably February of 21, is that we needed to get all the financing together, go through the RFPs to get contractors. It's a process to gear up. But we geared up and we're on the ground, and we will be having some open houses. So even if you're not in a position to donate, certainly go to our website or click any of the links that have been shared tonight, and sign up for our emails so that you make sure, or click like on our page here so that you get updates about opportunities to get out there and see this building once it's rehabbed. It's unsafe to bring people on site. Obviously, it's an active construction site, so we can't be traipsing through it right now. It's a very small site as well. But once it's done, we're going to have an opportunity for people to come out and see it. And so to our friends at MPT, the state, Maryland Department of Transportation, and our friends who have been critical in this process at the local level, Reggie Turner and Terrence Moore and the entirety of the Western Maryland Community Development Corporation, we're thrilled to be able to bring this story and appreciate everyone tuning in tonight. Thank you for your support, and hope to be able to invite you out for an open house sometime this summer.